Hi, everyone. Happy December. Welcome to ACEC's monthly private market resources and economic outlook here on YouTube in 10 minutes or less. So, with that, let me go ahead and get started. I'm Erin McLaughlin, ACEC's Vice President of Private Market Resources. In our first slide today, we're going to look at the construction put in place numbers, which we look at every month, to gauge how we're doing with design and construction spending year over year. So for our most recent month that we have data for, which is October, we can see that compared to October of 2020, we are up almost 9% in design and construction spending. But following the trend that we've seen for the last, year and a half or so, this is really due to residential spending, which is up 17% year over year. And it was up in 20 from 2019. Now, one of the exciting things is that this is the first month in quite a while where both private non-residential and public spending are also both up year over year. So pretty exciting. We're seeing private non-residential up 3% and public pretty flat, but up about 0.5%. So when we look at the total year over year for January through October of 2021 versus 2020, we see those continuation trends that we talked about of residential being up over 24%. And for year over year, we actually see private, non-residential, and public each down about 4 or 5%. Now, this chart shows sort of the trend lines, and I often like to show this chart just so folks can see that private design and construction spending is more significant than public and also drives that total number. And you can see that public, the green line at the bottom, is fairly flat. Now, one of the things that we track very carefully that obviously we care a lot about is what AE revenues are doing. So the Census Bureau produces a quarterly services survey, and since I talked to you all last month, we've gotten the results of the third quarter. And in the third quarter, year over year, we are doing much better than we did during the actual pandemic. So the third quarter of 2021, we had $87.6 billion in AE revenue. And as you can see in the bar chart, we sort of dipped down about 12% last year when we entered the recession, and we held that flat, like 12% decline until about the first quarter of this year. And then we came back up, but we are pretty flat in the third quarter of this year from the second quarter. So we're actually about 2% down total from our peak best quarter ever, which was the fourth quarter of 2019. Now, I often like to show this following chart, which shows just how long our last recession was. And it wasn't 2 or 3 quarters, it was actually about 4 years. And so, this chart is just a reminder that all recessions are not the same, and that after entering into the Great Recession at the end of 2008, we stayed very flat from about 2009 through 2014 when we started gaining revenues. And then again, we peaked in the fourth quarter of 2019. So hopefully we'll get back to that all-time high number one of these quarters coming up. Now, one thing that's really interesting is, and for those of you that follow our other output that we've recently done in conjunction with the ACEC Research Institute, is that we've done a forecast in conjunction with the Research Institute and Rockport Analytics to measure what the results of the infrastructure bill will be for AE output. And so this chart just shows that now that we've passed the infrastructure bill and it's been signed into law, it could mean an additional $132 billion in AE output over the next 5 years. So this is an additional 5.6% on an annual basis during this period. It also means that there's going to be 82,000 jobs in our sector, annually that need to be filled in order for us to meet that challenge. So labor considerations remain a significant concern as I talk to members and as you all talk to each other. We know that that's, becoming our biggest concern in the design and construction community. Now, one of the things that I wanted to share with you all is the National Association for Business Economics, of which ACEC is a member. They do some really interesting quarterly surveys, and the most recent quarterly survey is their semi-annual Outlook survey. So this slide is pretty dense, but there are just a couple pieces of it that I wanted to pull out and share with you all. The first is that the economic panelists, and there's about 50 panelists that do the forecast, have downgraded their growth projections. So, we are still projecting economic growth, still projecting an increase in GDP next year, but it's been downgraded. And really, this is for a couple key reasons. One of which is inflation, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the other one is, sort of the continued pressures of not having as vaccinated a population as we would like. However, I did want to also note at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that the majority, 58% of panelists, do anticipate that the supply of goods will begin to normalize in the first half of 2022. So I think that's really key for our industry, especially as construction materials related to that residential construction and an increase in public construction that we may feel from that infrastructure bill. That supply of goods will be really important to us as we need to, as we are designing for more building. Now, the next slide sort of shows when the panelists feel that inflation will decline. Now, many of you may be aware that the Federal Reserve has two target goals, one of which is maximum employment, and then the second is a 2% inflation, and we have exceeded that. Now, most panelists are now saying that this is not transitory, and even Federal Reserve Chair Powell noted that this is not a transitory situation anymore. And most analysts feel that it will be the second half, H2, of 2023 or later when we will actually see that 2% inflation target. So that's a significant shift from what we were all hearing and thinking about even as recently as the last couple of months. So why do we have all of these problems? Now, what's very interesting is the overwhelming consensus seems to be that what could keep inflation higher than that 2% target, and what we are not seeing with regards to the ease is about the supply chain bottlenecks. So in the Outlook survey, I posted the response here on the slide, questions 1B and 1C, that sort of show that. And this is really interesting to us as we have recently done a deep dive into the intermodal and logistics market, into how our infrastructure planning and design work can help solve these problems. So I encourage you all to check out our most recent private industry brief, which is on the ACEC website, which speaks to this market. And we also had our very first private market symposium in Charleston earlier this month, where we had thought leaders and members really connecting and thinking about how we can help this market advance and how we can seize the opportunity that this market presents. Now, the next slide, and this is really key for our industry as well, talks to one of the main factors that is also contributing to inflation. And what it is, it's the rising wages. So, inflation is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As goods and services get more expensive, we have to pay our folks more money. And that includes us in our industry. So it's just very, very interesting. And it's also very interesting in an industry such as ours, where we have a shortage of engineers and a shortage of design professionals. The fact that we do have to compete with one another and raise wages is really key, especially, and this is going to provide a constraint, unfortunately, to our members, especially those that have long-term public IDIQ, MSA kind of contracts where their escalations may not fit this model of having to raise wages. So what is the reason for this? I think in our industry, we know that we've had a little bit of an issue with there just not being enough engineers. But when you look around and you think about all of the industries, what is really the constraint with regards to labor? And I think one thing that's really, really interesting is that, earlier in the pandemic, the conversation was really about caregivers and women exiting the workforce, which is certainly still a consideration. But the additional, which ranked number one in question 3B on the NABE Outlook survey, is the increased rate of retirement. So that is what people are calling the Great Resignation. And when you think of the demographics of the baby boomer generation, how large it is, and that Generation X is a little bit smaller coming up, and that our millennials are still generally maybe 40, 41 and younger, you can see how we may have a constrained pipeline for talent and people to sort of take over, and the challenge of succession planning. And what's also accelerating, folks probably retiring and having a great resignation moment, is that even though we've been in a recession, our stock market has still been really healthy. So, just a very unusual situation that has created some really unique situations that we find ourselves in. Now, that sort of wraps up most of our data points that we wanted to share with you this month, all new information, but I encourage you to go ahead and check out our other private market and economic resources. If you visit acec.org under business resources and private market resources, you'll see all of our information, including the backlog of our other monthly economic presentations here on YouTube, as well as information on our next private market symposium, which will hit the really hot market of residential real estate as well as commercial real estate. We'll be in Scottsdale, Arizona, the first Thursday and Friday in March. And we also have our private industry briefs and our column in Engineering Inc. magazine, as well as our podcasts. And here's our schedule of our upcoming symposiums for those of you that may be interested. The one after commercial and residential real estate is healthcare and science and technology. We'll be going to Cambridge, Massachusetts at the end of April, and then next fall visiting Houston for energy and utilities. And with that, here's my contact information. I encourage any of you all that have any economic or market trends that you would like us to look into to reach out to me, and have a great holiday season. Thank you.